everybody who made today happen. There was a lot of coordination that went on, especially Oldtown Church for hosting us today, because this is just a beautiful church and it does tell part of our story for our program today. So I'm going to introduce Pastor Kelly, who's hidden on me. She's going to give you just a quick history of the church so you can kind of fill in where you're sitting. Excellent. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Sometimes I have to say it twice, but you did okay, so we'll go with the first one. I am Pastor Kelly. I've been here as the pastor for the past 13 years, but this is also the church that I grew up in, so my roots go much deeper than just the last 13 years. But our church here in Oldtown, we actually started at the Newman Congregational Church in Rumford, for any of you who know where that is, Rumford, Rhode Island. But in 1710, there was a request to have a church here in the Attleborough area. And so they put the request in, it was granted, and we came here in 1712. This is not our first building, this is our third building actually. Our first building was across the street where the schoolhouse is now, and we believe it was about the same size, about the size of the schoolhouse. It took them 4 years to build that building because, as we tell the children who come on tours here, there was no Home Depot or Lowe's or anything like that to go buy materials. They had to make or harvest from the land what they needed. Once they built the building, so many families that had come to the area, it became too small. So they were only there for about 10 years in that building. They then built a second building down Old Post Road, just before you get to the little bridge that goes across the water. So our second building was there. I did not see it, it was before my time, but it's said that it looks just like this building, only a little bit smaller. And they were there for about 100 years. Until something happened. We don't know what it was, but something happened and that building was deemed inhabitable. So they were no longer allowed to use it. So they did use the tavern and a few of the mills in town to get together for meetings, whether it was community meetings or church meetings. And then in the 1820s, they started building this church. In 1828, our doors opened here, and we have been here ever since. Just a few little historical pieces about our church. Our organ was put in 1860, or in the 1860s. Obviously there was no electricity at that time, so it was a hand-pumped organ where they would pay a boy or a man to go up and pump the organ during service. And there's actually a sign on the back where everyone put their initials and the dates that they served. Also, all of the lights were oil lamps at one point before the gift of electricity, but we have updated those now. And as you've heard, we do have indoor bathrooms. You don't have to use the outhouse anymore. Our windows in the sanctuary are original windows, so for the ones that are open back there, you can see that it's the wavy or glass. It looks like as Carolyn Christian always says, it looks like a fun house when you look outside. But I'm sure if you came in the front doors, you noticed something different about our church. Usually when you walk in the front doors of a church, the front of the church is down there. We are referred to as the backwards church. And I always say we're backwards for many, many reasons. But the way our church was built, it copied the building before this, our second building. And they built the church this way for safety reasons. The only way in and out of the church were through these two front doors, so anyone who came in, the whole congregation could see them. By the time the church was built in 1828, we didn't have, I don't believe there was as much worry about Native Americans or people coming to attack, but we built this, the sanctuary was built the same way. It wasn't until 1990 that back doors were put on and our fellowship hall was added. So we really just had this part. I know I got married here in 1990 and you had to come in the front door and walk all the way around to come up front. So it's just a different way of being. The shutters on our windows were also used for safety. So if there was something going on outside, they could be closed, but it could also kind of control the heat. Sun coming in, too much light, as our camera people know, so we tried to, so we keep those the same way. Last thing I'll tell you about is the little pew doors. I don't know if you've seen that in churches before. Because there was no central heat in the church when the church was built, people would bring their foot warmer with them, which was a little box that they would put a warm stones or a warm brick in, and they'd place them in their pew, and it would keep the heat inside. Now the little pew doors are to contain our children so that they can come over during worship. If you have more questions about the Oldtown Church, anyone that you see with a gold name tag, those are Oldtown Church people. After our presentation, which I'm sure is going to be amazing, I'm going to stay in the sanctuary, so if you have any questions about the history here, I'd be more than happy to answer. Okay? Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for coming. I'm going to introduce now Dr. Samuel Forman. He's a historian. He's a Harvard University faculty member. He's educated in history of the American Revolution as well as the practice of clinical and preventative medicine. Throughout his successful career as a physician, a military officer, and a business person, he's publicly lectured on historical topics that inform current issues. His first novel was the nonfiction American Founder's biography on Dr. Joseph Warren, who will be centered in our story today. And thank you for coming, Dr. Forman. We look forward to it.
Good afternoon. Can people hear me in the back?
Yes.
Excellent. I'm wired for sound, and I'm not familiar with the acoustics in this historic building, which seem to be actually quite excellent. So I'm really happy to join you this afternoon. I'm really pleased by the turnout. And I'm here for a couple of reasons. Dr. Joseph Warren is heavily identified with the Solemn League and Covenant, whose document executed here in Attleborough in 1774 is the only surviving such document in private hands. So that as biographer of Dr. Warren and the current owner of that document, I wanted to share with you the context of it, of this treasure of American history, and hopefully increase your awareness of the times and use this document as a means of getting in touch with some of the activities and controversies and inspiring stories of our revolutionary forebears, specifically the ones who lived right here in Attleborough. Why Joseph Warren? I think I had mentioned that he is the author of this Solemn League and Covenant document, but he's also a principal figure in the activities leading up to the beginning of the Revolutionary War and in the first few months of that war. He was involved in virtually all of the important activities of the Boston Sons of Liberty and the regional agitation for American rights in North America within the British Empire from a very early date. So in a way, although there are many, many hands who made this history happen, some of which signed the document that we're going to talk about today, Dr. Warren himself is presumed to be the author of that document and is an exemplar of the era. So I'm going to talk some about the biography of Dr. Warren, just who he was. He's not so well known now, and what his hand was in some of these events, including that one highlighted in red, the Solemn League and Covenant, which is an activity on the chain of, in hindsight, what became the independence of America and the creation of the United States of America. So let's start at his beginning. He came from south of Boston, not quite so far south as you are, but Roxbury. And he was a multi-generation, I guess second or third generation Warren. His grandparents had come over as a seaman, we believe, in the late 17th century. And the family established a homestead in Roxbury, which at that point was a small market town outside of Boston and astride the main road, land road, to Boston. He was the eldest of 4 brothers, some of whom turned out to be very influential in themselves. And the farm itself had a few acres and was diversified. So these were hard-working people whom would have dirt under their fingernails. And that kind of background, a yeoman farmer background, was something that he apparently was very proud of, and many patriots were very proud of. Although established leaders in Massachusetts at the time, who later became known as Tories, were disproportionately of an upper class that did not have to work. Not all of them, but many of them. So that Warren, later in his life, would be made fun of as being a middle-class yeoman farmer. He was proud of it. They were trying to diminish him by that location. Now, or by that title. The Roxbury farm included some orchards, and there were many orchards around Roxbury in the 17th and 18th century. And the Warrens got to be known in the agricultural community as adapting the first practical market apple in the United States, the Warren russet. Sometimes you run into these at farmers markets. They will also go under the name of Roxbury russet or Boston russet. They were really quite an innovation at the time, and presumably all the family members were involved in it, including the women, in taking cuttings and refining the strain, because it had a very high sugar content. And most apples in that time were not eaten as we would eat an apple as a snack or as food, but rather as raw material for apple butter, apple cider, apple pies, that kind of thing. Also, it entered the international trade because they would be stable enough to pack by the barrel and ship down to the Caribbean, where they would be exchanged in the triangular trade as one of the trade goods. So it not only had local consumption, would feed the family, but also was a trade good for barter and for cash. The Roxbury russets and their high sugar content could make one heck of a cider, because that sugar content turns to alcohol. So you could get an apple cider. We have some reenactors here. Maybe you want to actually live this, I don't know. You can get a cider of about 8 to 9% ethanol, alcohol, out of these Boston russet apples because the sugar content's so high. That would be maybe twice or more than hard ciders which you could buy at the packaged goods store, right? Also, these Warren russets, or Roxbury russets, they ripened very late in the season. So even you would wait for the first frost, perhaps in October, to harvest the Warren russets. So they had a head start to survive the winter in your cellar. So they were relatively good compared to the competition in lasting over the winter, and also in shipping long distances. Now, there was a downside, though, of this late fall, first frost kind of harvest, which caught up with them. Joseph Warren's father suffered an agricultural accident, unfortunately during the harvest of 1755, when Joseph Warren was about 14 years old. His father, apparently reaching out for that last juicy apple on the branch, slipped, fell, and broke his neck. And he lived for a short time, the accounts say, and one of the first people to render assistance was his youngest son, who was about 2 or 3 years old at the time, Joseph Warren's youngest brother, who attended his father in his last moments. A very sad and traumatic episode. Leaving Mrs. Warren as a widow with 4 children. Now, she was a plucky sort, and that was not about to stop her. So she was, with some assistance from the church and people in the community, was able to maintain the family and the homestead. As a mother of 4, you certainly called upon those children to work, perhaps more than some families, certainly rich families would, to maintain their position in Roxbury. In fact, Mother Warren made sure, by mortgaging the farm at one point, to send her eldest child, Joseph Warren, to college, Harvard College, which he entered at age 14. Not that unusual at the time, that gets a little gas, people entering college then, but to enter Harvard between about age 14 and 17 or 18, pretty typical. Maybe he was a little bit on the young side, but nothing that drew attention to people. While he was at college, he was a standout student, and it's recorded that he had a flair for dramatics. We would put on like informal plays in his rooms at Harvard. His dormitory still survives, incidentally, at Harvard. And plays officially in Massachusetts were considered licentious and illegal. So there was no paid performances in Massachusetts, not until long after Warren's time. But there was a very vital amateur type of community of thespians, performers. And Joseph Warren was a standout in that mode, both for himself and to enlist his colleagues in student productions. And the one production that is recalled is a play that was very well known at the time. It's called Cato. It's about a Roman Republican senator who was resisting tyranny emerging from Julius Caesar. So in other words, it's set in Roman times. But it was very well known, and it attracted people who were interested in democratic values, or such they were at the time, representative government, and conversely opposing tyranny and dictatorial type rule. Probably the most famous line that perhaps Joseph Warren himself uttered if he played Cato, the principal role, was towards the end of the play. Cato and his Republican forces get defeated by Julius Caesar, and he chooses suicide over submitting to a tyranny. And the line from the play, to paraphrase, is that I regret that I have but one life to live for my country. And that might sound familiar from another revolutionary figure who was probably recalling this play. The play itself was so popular amongst leadership of what came to be the Continental Army that it was a favorite of George Washington. And he is known to have attended several performances, including at Williamsburg, but also commissioning that the play be performed for the Revolutionary Army in what came to be the Revolutionary War. So Joseph Warren graduated in the class of 1759. He became a Mason in the St. Andrew's Lodge. And I'm not going to go into Joseph Warren's Masonic type of experience, but it was quite impressive so far as leadership, and to this day is considered an inspiring figure in Massachusetts Masonry and really Masonry nationally. He befriended Paul Revere, who was not a middle-class person, but a working-class person, silversmith, jack of all trades, in the Masonic Lodge in Boston. Joseph Warren apprenticed to Dr. James Lloyd in 1761, shortly after he graduated. Apprenticeship typically was a 2-year apprenticeship to become a physician. Now, I am a physician, which is, I guess, my first entree into becoming Dr. Warren's biographer. So I'll do a little digression for folks who may not know. There were 3 ways to become a physician in colonial Massachusetts. First way was that you would go to medical school, get a Doctor of Medicine degree, and you would be a physician. Now, there weren't very many choices to do that in colonial North America in 1761 when he started. There was a medical school that just started in Philadelphia, attached to the college that had become the University of Pennsylvania. There's a medical school there. There were medical schools in Europe, but your parents had to be rich enough to send you to Europe. And there were favored medical schools there in Europe, in London and in Glasgow, and if you mastered the languages, in Paris and Leiden and places like that. If you were fortunate enough to have a family that could sponsor you to that kind of medical education, you would come back to colonial North America as probably the most prestigious kind of physician, so far as your education and training, and it would be easiest to establish yourself. That wasn't open to Joseph Warren, so he chose the second route, and that is that you would apprentice yourself. This is through a kind of a formal apprenticeship to a physician that ideally had that kind of European background, had a great reputation and a big patient base, and you would study in residence under that physician. That's the route that Dr. Joseph Warren took. Now, the third route, I don't know, are there any libertarians in the audience? You don't have to admit it because, you know, those who are very proud of it. But at any rate, I won't talk modern politics, but it does have some interesting resonance. The third route to becoming a physician was to put out a shingle declaring yourself to be a doctor. And if patients came, that was the proof of it. There is no government regulation or licensure. There is no licensures of any health-related professionals until probably the 1830s. So that was a viable route to become a physician. And one of the Sons of Liberty, who were political activists, was fellow physician Thomas Young, who's probably even lesser known than Joseph Warren was, but he did get to name the state of Vermont somewhere along the line. And, but at any rate, Thomas Young had that background of just declaring himself a physician. So the two of them would have at each other of Joseph Warren accusing Dr. Young of being a quack. And this is in the newspapers because you didn't have malpractice cases, in the courts. So they would kind of fight these things out in what we would call the tabloid press. So Joseph Warren let at Thomas Young with just full range of sarcasm that is hilarious and jokes. I won't bore you with any of those here. And Dr. Young was very much on the defensive. Samuel Adams eventually helped patch up the rift between the two of them, but that's what it was about. So at any rate, Warren, in addition to being an active physician, starting out at a time when compared to emerging revolutionary fervor, in hindsight, was about the optimal or the time to become a physician in Boston at the same time where political rifts were emerging between colonial North America and the parent country. Warren joined a club called the Sons of Liberty, which was an informal political organization focusing and crystallizing the rationale and resistance to colonial measures that they called dictatorial from the parent country, encroaching on regional autonomy in North America. He probably was recruited into that by the publisher of the Boston Gazette, which published very many, if not most, of the patriot-oriented pieces, often under pseudonyms, in the Boston area throughout the early revolutionary time frame. Became personal protege and political protege of Samuel Adams by the late 1760s. In the late 1760s, opposition to British colonial practices were often focused on tariffs being determined in London, in Parliament, and imposed on colonial North America, including Massachusetts. And the Boston Sons of Liberty, took very great offense against these duties, like the Townshend duties, as encroaching on regional autonomy. Now, mind you, Massachusetts and the other colonies were always subservient to the mother country. But for decades, that was sort of a benign neglect, and there had been a lot of regional autonomy. But after the French and Indian War, when the British war debt went up many-fold from what it was before to pay for the war that they had just fought against France, in the mid-1760s onward, the British had campaign after campaign to basically up the revenue being extracted from North America to pay the British national debt. But from the American standpoint, or the colonial North Americans' standpoint, that was encroaching upon the colonies' ability to govern themselves within the empire. Boycotts and riotous behavior came to a head in Boston on March 5th, 1770, and what became the Boston Massacre. That massacre, in part, was triggered by British soldiers being stationed in Boston to, ideally, to tamp down these riotous boycotts fomented by the Sons of Liberty against these British policies and the merchants who were trying to carry out these British policies. Joseph Warren did autopsy on some of the people who were killed in the massacre and also assisted in writing the official Patriot view of that. That paroxysm of violence in Boston in 1770 cooled down for a couple of years as the British contingent in Boston were pulled back to what is now Fort Independence, I believe, but it was the fort guarding Boston, rather, on the streets of Boston. But the Sons of Liberty organized what we know as the Boston Tea Party when a new round of these taxes were being imposed upon Boston. Now, the tea-related ones coming from Parliament were kind of different than the previous duties and more onerous in a way, because the tax on tea that was newly enacted by Parliament, of course, they did not consult North America or the province on this, they just dictated it. But it was not only a tax, but it was also a monopoly. Like, no one else could import tea except from the East India Company and had to pay the tax. So it had these overtones about not only another tax being imposed by a group thousands of miles away, but also was a monopoly. So Joseph Warren and the Boston Sons of Liberty organized a resistance to the tea, where 3 tea ships showed up in Boston Harbor. Other tea ships showed up in other principal harbors in North America, like New York and Philadelphia. But unlike those other places where even like Governor Tryon in New York had the good sense to recognize this as sort of a flashpoint type of issue. So in New York, they didn't even let the tea land. They just said, turn the ships back and send them back. And they didn't defuse the underlying political rift, but they did diffuse the issue as a reason for violence or riot. But not so in Boston. Acting Governor Hutchinson just insisted that this tea be landed. There was a series of meetings at Old South Meeting House organized by the Boston Sons of Liberty to try to defuse this crisis. The Sons of Liberty determined that this tea, which was landed into warehouses in Boston, never be distributed. So the Tory-dominated political appointee governor was at loggerheads with the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty tried through public meetings to try to defuse this. When that didn't seem to happen, Samuel Adams, who was chairing these concourse of the public, as he called it, at the Old South Meeting House, said there was nothing more to be done. And Indians seemed to, Native Americans or people painted to look like them, sort of appeared out of nowhere, descended on the ships in the harbor and dumped the tea in the harbor. Now, we call it the Tea Party now, and it sounds like a little tiff between us and the British, where everybody's, sipping the tea out of their cups and when they finally make up, and maybe it has those overtones. But for the first 50 years after the event, it was more appropriately called destruction of the tea. Because in a time when corporate and personal property was sacrosanct, people would be executed for stealing silver spoons. The idea that organized groups of kind of faceless people, so far as individuals, they're disguised, are destroying what would now be millions and millions of dollars worth of a private cargo and defying the British imperial government was pretty nervy. And there were British soldiers around Boston who could have intervened, and in fact, by rumor at the time, had loaded their guns and their cannons and were ready to clear the mob, but didn't, fortunately, and the tea got destroyed. Joseph Warren's role in the Tea Party is a little obscure because he was very good about not leaving his fingerprints on things. But I believe he was a driver of it. First of all, it had a lot of dramatic flair to it. The idea of Native Americans dressed up. There's a lot of accounts saying that they were even talking gibberish to each other, in this pantomime of being Indians. And they even John Adams wrote about it in his diary, and they even fooled him for a little while. He apparently wasn't in the inner circle of the Sons of Liberty at that point. He thought the Native Americans had come from the praying Indians out in Natick, and, until he got put straight a few days later, that these were not Native Americans. But at any rate, Joseph Warren was on the podium at the Old South Meeting House. No speeches or anything are recorded, but I suspect he was the stage manager of it. There was a lot of coordination that had to be done to make sure these Indians emerged from the Old South Meeting House and the alleys just at the right time. Many of the accounts say that there were 3 groups of them acting simultaneously. Organizing that was quite the challenge. So someone who had a background in drama and what have you might be a good fit for it. But at any rate, also he was the head of the St. Andrew's Lodge of Masons, who disproportionately, as it turned out, supplied the Indians who tossed the tea. Also, the next morning after the Tea Party, he called in, Joseph Warren, acting for the Sons of Liberty, called in Paul Revere, sent Paul Revere with the news to the New York Sons of Liberty, who in turn sent it to Philadelphia. So he was wired into this in a big way, and he had the authority, apparently amongst the Sons of Liberty, to dispatch Paul Revere on a ride that was much longer and in a way dramatic as the one that Paul Revere is famous for at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. He sent this word as faster than the British authorities could get the word to like-minded patriots in other cities. So what about the Solemn League and Covenant? The American patriots, who at that point were not fighting for independence, but for regional autonomy in the British Empire, and what they saw as constitutional rights. When they said constitutional rights, they were talking about a British Constitution. And one might infer, they didn't say exactly, that by acting in disguise in Boston, they showed a very united front against the British authority that would tax the tea or do other taxes as well. So rather than the authorities they took away the ability of the authorities to hone down and prosecute an individual person. They were acting as Boston and Massachusetts acting in a united fashion. Now, there were some Tories and British sympathizers in Massachusetts who didn't want to have any part of that, but they were in the minority, and the Boston town meeting by early June 1774 was basically being dominated by the Boston Sons of Liberty. So the Sons of Liberty were probably hoping that the British authorities, seeing this kind of widespread and fundamental resistance to this Tea Act, would back down and do some face-saving maneuver that would preserve some level of autonomy for North America. After all, that's what they did after the the Stamp Act in 1765. There were riots, and then the British mostly backed down for a few years. Perhaps the Patriots were hoping for that. But that's not what they got. So the Tea Party happened in mid-December of 1773. So with these months of waiting, of course there's delays with information going across the Atlantic, Parliament deliberating and talking with the king, and then action coming back, as what would the British authorities, the imperial authorities, do? Would they back down as hoped or not? Well, the answer was no. Heck no. In draconian measures that even surprised, I think, the Boston Sons of Liberty. Parliament passed, and the news got to Boston by around June of 1774, that the port of Boston would be closed down for trade, for everybody. Doesn't matter whether you were a Tory merchant or a patriot-leaning merchant, for everybody. And for a town depending on its international commerce, that was draconian. Shut it down. And then some other acts trickled in over the summer. If you were accused of destroying British property or had some offense against the British crown, you would no longer be tried in Boston, like the British soldiers who were involved in the massacre. No, you would be taken to some other place in the empire at the governor's or other officials' discretion and be tried there. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, right? And these are trickling out, like the news of them are trickling out. And then the third one, which really got the Patriots going, was called the Massachusetts Government Act. And that is that the governor would no longer be accountable in any way or be a civilian like Governor Hutchinson was, but would be a military person. General Gage was appointed to be governor of Massachusetts. And not only that, his council, which in the previous administrations were appointees subject to approval of the elected House of Representatives. Now, that's changed. Now they're simply appointees of the Crown, the Mandamus Council. So the Patriots, who were all along concerned about what they characterized as onerous and arbitrary power being exercised over colonial North America, seem to have their worst fears being proven as these three acts in succession came out during the summer of 1774. Patriots labeled them, and you'll see them in your textbooks now as the Intolerable Acts. To the British authorities, what is the problem? These are the Massachusetts Government Acts designed to make the government in subservient colonial North America, specifically restive Massachusetts, be more logical and responsive. What is the problem, right? So there's really a fundamental difference there. Hence, the Solemn League and Covenant. The Boston Sons of Liberty, who were just about to officially take over Boston Town Meeting, distributed a pre-printed document that we would call a boycott document to all the towns of Massachusetts, who already were corresponding through the committees of correspondence, where patriots in Attleborough would be receiving letters from Boston and answering, and they would be refining their arguments and coordinating how they should respond. So this originated in Boston, and it asked for something that hadn't been asked for before. It asked that the citizens of the town, actually not just citizens, but everyone in town, swear by God that they would do three things. They would not import any goods from Great Britain. They would not consume any goods from Great Britain. And they would put sanctions on people who did. So the Solemn League and Covenant document, that name itself was charged at the time, and it resonates back to the English Civil War and resistance of, 100 years before, to what was considered arbitrary government coming out of Great Britain. But there wasn't the word boycott in those days, incidentally. Boycott is a 19th century term. In a way, this is more precise. Non-importation, non-consumption, sanctions on people who deal in this stuff. Three distinct things. Now, the document was printed and had the space for signatures. Now, when it went out to the towns, there was an article, a kind of covering article in the Massachusetts Boston Gazette, probably written. Now, the reason why we think this was written by Joseph Warren, his name isn't on the document, but during the time that it was prepared and circulated, the other principal patriots in the Sons of Liberty were at the meeting of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, which was not meeting in Boston, but was meeting in Salem at the time. And the delegation was led by Samuel Adams. So Joseph Warren was the ranking son of liberty in Boston at the time. So that's why we believe that he inspired it, probably wrote it, given the wording. But here was the controversy. The newspaper article, which Warren probably also wrote, said, this document is out there in the towns. People are crowding and tripping over themselves to sign it. Before that was the case. So he got a little ahead of himself. So the enemies of this kind of thing, the loyalists and even some tepid type of patriots, kind of said, that's not true. We just received this thing. We need to talk to our town meetings about it. We need to consider it. Some folks in some towns took offense. This is a political issue. What do you mean, swear to God? God doesn't take sides in this kind of thing. Does he or she? So there was a level of that, and then there was a process. We're not just all willy-nilly going to sign it. Most towns put it before their town meeting. And then there was the who should sign this thing? Should it be voters, who at this time were white males with property? Because there were a lot more people being involved in these discussions than just folks with the formal right to vote. In some towns, women signed the Solemn League and Covenant, and by their names, some black and minority people signed it as well. And in those towns, apparently they were welcome to do that because almost everybody would have some input into, like a householder, what do I buy for my household goods? Women often had that role in that time frame. What do I consume? Do I use something that had come from Great Britain? Lots of people could decide that one way or the other, and in many towns they were welcome to pony up and put their name on this document. The sanctions, the wording of the sanctions has teeth in it. If you don't sign this thing, and I even quoted some of the wording, some of the use of English I think is a little arcane and almost amusing, but at any rate, the one that got my attention is, if you don't sign up for this, you are a contumacious importer, which I believe means worthy of contempt. Even before I knew the meaning of that, I just saw that word. It's you don't want to be contumacious. However, that would actually have some danger if you were in Boston and maybe some other towns where the Sons of Liberty were very active. You would be called out. Your business would be vandalized. You might be terrorized personally. And that's sort of in between the lines here. You will be considered contumacious importers. Withdraw all commercial connections with them and publish their names to the world. Throw you to the mob. Pretty strong document. So this document came to Attleborough and many other towns. Is there any interest in me taking just a couple of minutes to talk about your document, the Town of Attleborough document? Okay. It is one of, best I can tell, 5 surviving documents. 3 of them and the only one in private hands is the one I happen to own. And I sort of blundered into it. I'm not a collector, per se. The others are institutionally owned. There are 3 of them at the American Antiquarian Society, and 1 is a centerpiece at the Concord, Massachusetts Public Library, where it has a place of honor. So a couple of aspects of it. if dozens, maybe 100 or more of these were circulated, why did so many disappear? Or why did so few survive? Well, I believe, in the summer of 1774, the Patriots had just sort of pulled away for the House of Representatives no longer to be directly answerable to the British imperial government. So it became the first Massachusetts Provincial Congress. But in the summer, it hadn't quite organized. So there were no Patriot or American organized organs of government. There was no place to keep these things or preserve them. So my belief is that they were posted in town, and for towns that had heavy Patriot presence, they were in fact executed. That is, people signed up, probably in public, maybe swearing, maybe in the predecessor of this church itself. But after the document was signed, executed, and probably posted, there was no place to archive it. There was no Patriot government. Now, there would be in the future, but there wasn't then. Also, the document itself, and I invite you to read it. In fact, let me give you a little pitch on behalf of the Historical Society. Mr. Butler, who's very active in historically minded things in the region, contacted me about a year ago to get a super high quality copy of the original. This thing is so good that if some dishonest person cut off the bottom that says that it's a reproduction, they could probably pass it off as a real one. It's that good. So I would encourage you to have your own, and you have your own piece of Attleborough history on your wall, but also to read it. The content of it is a boycott in reaction to the Boston Port Bill, which was the first 3 of the Intolerable Acts. It doesn't make any reference to the other acts because the news of them hadn't arrived yet. So in a way, it became what we would call OBE, overtaken by events. Right? So there are other things coming down in the summer of 1774 that were even getting more attention than the Port Bill, like the mandamus counselors. So the content of it was getting to be obsolete at the same time that the Massachusetts Patriots realized that they couldn't do this thing alone. They really needed concerted action on a boycott of this aggressiveness with the other colonies. So the wheels were turning for what came to be the First Continental Congress. And the agitation and the political movements down in New York, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, all up and down the coast, Virginia, were occurring during the summer of 1774. And they crystallized by late summer and set the date of the First Continental Congress to be in Philadelphia in September of 1774. So from 2 levels, the content of the Solemn League and Covenant became overtaken by historical events. My guess is that your copy was taken down after it was no longer as pressing as some of these other issues and put in their closet. And in other towns were just discarded. And that's my understanding is why there's so few of them around. One last talk, it seems like I'm running even overtime here, is when I acquired this document, almost by accident on eBay, my assumption was that until proven otherwise, someone had stolen it and or it was a fake. And I got roped into the enthusiasm of eBay auctions and kind of regret that. So I made some calls to Attleborough. Unfortunately, and this was about 10 years ago, I unfortunately didn't link up with key people in the historical community at that time, or else I would have gotten the full story. But I did link up with the police and with the oldest person I could find at the public library to ask, have you are you knowledge of a document like this ever being in Attleborough? Has there been such a thing? Has there been a theft? Nothing. Nothing at all. I looked in old histories of the town. Many Massachusetts towns have their town histories published, often in the 19th century, and they were very thorough. And when a town had a relic of this power and rarity, they would usually brag about it in the town history. The town history for Attleboro, nada. No mention of it at all. So then on the authenticity, when I found out that there were 3 copies of these at the American Antiquarian Society, I went there, having done research for Dr. Warren and other things there, they know me. So I convinced the chief archivist to trot out their 3 copies and compare them to Attleborough's. So we put them on a light box, and sure enough, there's a watermark on the paper, and it's the same watermark on the 3 actuals as yours. Then we got out some very powerful hand magnifying glasses to play sleuth with the typeface. You remember in your whodunit novels, if there were a ransom document on a typewriter, you look very close at the paper, and there are little imperfections in the typeface, and you could use it to track a typewriter. Of course, people don't use typewriters anymore. But at any rate, it used to be a great plot device when I was not gray-headed. But at any rate, so we did the same by looking very closely at the authentic documents for very minor, changes in the letter D and X and things like that. And the kind that you could tell under 10 or 50 power magnifying glass, you couldn't see this with the naked eye. And sure enough, they were identical on the Attleboro copy. So it is undoubtedly authentic. I also hired their chief conservator, who was moonlighting, to stabilize the Attleboro document. It has some tears in it. Okay, so now the signatories. There are, in the Attleboro document, best I can tell, there are no women, there are no people of color or slaves. They do show up in some other of the surviving documents, not here. So it probably tells you some about the social organization of Attleboro at that time. I don't know, I'll leave that to the local historians. In the upper right-hand corner is a fellow by the name of John Daggett, who the militia people will know. And he was very active, apparently not only politically, but in the Minutemen and militia type organization. In fact, he organized a raid against some Tories in, I guess, what was called Freetown about a week before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. And he also had distinguished service during the Revolutionary War. So he was a standout on the politics of this, and the upper right-hand corner of a signatory is usually considered like a place of honor or first person to sign, that kind of thing. And that's where his name appears. Let me just go back to the Solemn League. So what happened to the Solemn League? Overtaken by events, I'd mentioned. The shorthand, overtaken by the First Continental Congress. Joseph Warren, I'll just capsulize this, or the rest of Joseph Warren. Hopefully you'll take the time to read his biography. He's quite the extraordinary guy. He went on in the fall of 1774 to be involved with the Suffolk Resolves, which was not only a boycott document, but led into the organization of armed resistance in a defensive way against the British if the British were to persist on their onerous requirements. He wrote the Suffolk Resolves, and he was sure to have them sent as soon as they were signed to Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress was just getting organized. And Paul Revere did that right too. The delegates of the First Continental Congress were so impressed that they adopted it word for word as a resolution of the First Continental Congress. I'm not going to belabor the quotes of it, but Joseph Warren, as a speaker and someone who, turn of phrase, did not pull any punches, was very flowery, bombastic, but also extremely action-oriented. Quite a difference from some of the politicians of today. For those people who are into historic preservation, the house where the Suffolk resolves were formulated with delegates from all over Suffolk County survives and is the headquarters of the Milton Historical Society. And they do some with it. And so if you want to benchmark to them, it's an interesting place to do it. Joseph Warren enunciated patriotic sentiments and actions at annual commemorations of the Boston Massacre, which were central to broad communication of the patriot stances at that time. And he delivered actually two of them, which were delivered on the anniversary of the Boston Massacre in March of 1775 and 72. By March of 1775, Boston was occupied by British soldiers again, and it really seemed like military hostilities were likely. So in the audience, Samuel Adams and the other patriots actually invited British soldiers to this address to keep an eye on them, presumably. But it was a very inflammatory situation. In fact, there's a story that I believe is true, that a British soldier tried to intimidate Joseph Warren as Warren was about to give this speech, which was all about resistance to the British Empire policies, right? And the story is that the British soldier, and there were about 30 of them in the first rows of the Old South Meeting House, and thousands of patriots. Some Attleborough people probably wandered up to Boston. I don't know that for a fact, but a lot of surrounding towns sent people to the massacre orations to hear. There's supposed to be about 5,000 or 6,000 people listening to the March 1775 one, literally out on the sidewalks. Warren had to climb up a ladder to the window to get to the podium because he couldn't come into the front door. So the British soldier kind of brandished a handful of musket balls as if to say, "These are for you." So Warren saw this, and like I say, he's quite a showman. He delivered this address in a toga. Now, he didn't have in mind, I think, the movie Animal House. What he was doing was he was giving a visual of Roman Republican virtue. He was like dressed up like Cato to give this address. To my knowledge, it's the only major address in American history that was made in costume. So at any rate, he just took his white handkerchief and he dropped it over the handful of musket balls and went on and gave a speech. He just spent about 20, 30 seconds. Look at some of the words from this speech. Warren does not pull any punches. Here he is in a church. Look what he says. For his time, he was remarkably inclusive in his view of North Americans. He talks about Christian countries, laying waste to pagan countries as being unjust, and he speaks about that sarcastically. But basically, his message is aimed towards British authorities. He was still a practicing physician in Boston, about 3 blocks from the headquarters of British North America and occupied Boston. In fact, he was a leading patriot. They could have arrested him at any time. He was on a list of called the London Enemies list of people who could be arrested at any time, but he risked it and was not arrested. So apparently on the basis of a spy network that he was running, or just general observations, He called in response to British activities in Boston, mobilizing for something. He called in William Dawes and Paul Revere and assigned them to mobilize the Minutemen, activate the militia. This was just not some random act from a couple of Sons of Liberty. No, he's the president pro tem of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, where the better known ones were down in Philadelphia. He was sort of the ranking patriot in Boston. And he had authority to mobilize the militia, and that's what Paul Revere's ride was. Mobilize the militia. It was a proximate act in the igniting of the Revolutionary War. Did it from his office on Hanover Street in North Boston. There are rumors, persistent even in the time, that he had an uncanny knowledge of exactly what the British were up to. How did he know that? So there's a rumor that he had an in with Mrs. Gage, the general's wife. Now she was 17 years younger than the general, and just a little bit older than Joseph Warren's age, and considered like a very attractive socialite. She was an American Tory. She had friends on both sides, including patriots. So she was the kind of person that, the British sort of didn't trust and the Americans didn't trust either. So I'm not surprised that there were some rumors about her. She was considered gorgeous. This is a Copley painting of her in the most stylish Turkish-inspired dress. This Copley painting actually happens to sit in San Diego in their art museum. I have no idea why it's there, but it's very striking, and next time you're in San Diego, go say hello to Mrs. Gage. In the book, I have fun with the rumors, which I clearly identify as being fiction, as to why they came out and why they're not true. Beginning of the Revolutionary War, Joseph Warren joined the fighting, but he was also an effective leader when the government and the Continental Army hadn't even formed yet. He was everywhere during the siege of Boston. And so far as situational leadership in the 100 days or so between the outbreak of fighting on Lexington Battle Green and the North Bridge in Concord in mid-April of 1775 in the Battle of Bunker Hill, he was everywhere. And here's some of the kind of things that he was doing. Most notably, organizing the Patriot account of the Battle of Lexington and Concord and writing it, or at least making sure it was written, and making sure it got to England 2 weeks before the official British account. And so that was a propaganda coup, and it would have been aimed, I think, at a negotiated settlement even at that late date. It didn't have the desirable effect. He was even involved in the idea to bring the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston, to break the siege of Boston. And the siege of Boston was only 3 or 4 weeks old, and he never lived to see that. At Bunker Hill, when the British deployed, he decided that the place to be was a military contribution. That peace was not possible at that time. So he angled to become a major general in the Army with very little military experience. He was so charismatic that his fellow leaders acceded to this, but didn't yet have time to appoint him as major general. So he went out to the battlefield and fought as a common soldier. The original, people may recognize this picture as one of the earliest paintings, like an icon of the American Revolutionary War. The original title of this painting is The Death of Major General Joseph Warren at the Battle of Bunker's Hill, June 17, 1775. So sadly, the central figure in that picture is Joseph Warren, who was killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was quoted the day before his demise as this Latin phrase, dulce et decorum est pro patria more. My apologies for those people who really do know Latin. And it's a quote from an ancient poem that means it's sweet and proper to give one's life for one's country. I am privileged to be a biographer of Joseph Warren. I've also written on other Revolutionary War era issues more personally. And with that, I'm way over time. So I'll leave you with a couple of quotes from Joseph Warren and a way of speaking to not only the issues of the time, but conveying the responsibilities of individuals as citizens to approach serious problems, whatever time. The quote on the right is particularly inspiring, I think. So I'm going to end here. I was going to entertain questions from the podium, but I think we're so over time that maybe we won't do that. Okay, I'll entertain a few questions, and then I'll join you, for those who would want to stay, in the social room, and by all means, take part in the raffle and the reproduction of these documents that I hope I shared the background of. Questions? Sir?
The thing about Bunker Hill, could you explain again why he thought he was a common soldier? Because it seemed to me, from what I've read, they needed leadership more than they needed one more soldier. I mean, they needed someone to organize like that. The troops on Bunker Hill would not even support the troops being attacked on Breed's Hill. There was no cooperation between the various militias.
Yeah, it's amazing they did as well as they did.
I mean, really almost selfish. And why didn't he take...
I believe, and Joseph Warren didn't have a diary. And of course, even if he didn't live long enough to explain that one. But so I infer from what I know about Warren and his interest in government that was responsible and orderly, that although his appointment by the Massachusetts Provincial Congress was not approved by the entire Congress yet. And I think that procedure was something that he was insisting on. Like, until the representatives of the people confirm me as a commissioned Major General, I'm not a Major General. I believe that's what was going through his mind. But what is historically documented was he came out to the field after the battle already started. He had duties in the Committee of Safety, and he's the president of the Mass, he has these multiple hats. So he gets there on the battlefield after the battle's already started, and the ranking militia general, this is a 19th century engraving of it, that he confronts is Israel Putnam, who's sort of hanging back on Bunker Hill, which is about a half mile behind Breed's Hill, where the redoubt is. And they have this conversation. So in this engraving, commemorative of it, Warren's the one in civilian dress on the right, Putnam's on the left. He wouldn't really have had a uniform at that time, but at any rate, the engraver took liberties. But there is a conversation between the two of them, where Warren says, I'm here to fight, and Putnam is recorded as saying, the command is yours. I know that you've been appointed as a Major General. What are your orders? Now, Putnam used very colorful language, so the actual words were probably included some expletives. In response to Warren, who expressed that he was there not to command, but to, in effect, apprentice himself to people like Putnam, who were experienced soldiers, and that he was not a confirmed Major General. Now, the battle was going on. That exchange must have been brief. But the outcome of it was, for Putnam, okay, Joseph Warren, be that way. If you want to be in the hottest fighting, go forward and talk to Colonel Prescott in the dirt fort. And that's what Warren did.
Because it seems like if they had gotten some cooperation, some resupply and reinforcements, the folks on Breed's Hill could have resisted that third charge and maybe ended the war right there. Because I think people forget that was, for the British, the bloodiest battle of the war.
That's true, and there's no shortage of military minds who have discussed that and thought about it. General Ward, who was back at the Patriot headquarters in Cambridge had some ammunition and he was holding back. He didn't know whether the British would attack somewhere else, and so he had some rationale for holding back on the ammunition, but they ran out of it on Breed's Hill and got overrun. Warren was one of the last people to retreat from the American front line. He was killed, apparently shot in the head, and the British leadership themselves couldn't believe that the president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress was out there fighting in the front lines. So there's a whole story about identification of his body, digging him up, and rumors about it being insulted, and that sort of thing. But at any rate, he very deliberately, and I don't think it was because he was a coward, quite to the contrary, he believed that everything being done was a precedent for some American future. He didn't know what it was exactly, but he didn't want to cut corners. He did not consider himself a major general, even if the other ranking officers did. The same conversation happened at the forward position with Colonel Prescott. Colonel Prescott saw him, wow, there was a cheer, you know, the line militiamen. See, the president of the Provincial Congress has come right here with us. You know, we're exposed, but we're not betrayed, right? And Colonel Prescott offered him the command too, and he turned it down, presumably for the same reason.
Thank you for that.
Another question? Ma'am.
Is there any information about the percentage of people from Attleborough who didn't sign, who were eligible to sign, who didn't, and what, if any, consequences happened, or did it just become irrelevant so quickly that we really don't know?
Let me tell you that Mr. Rhett Butler is doing some wonderful research on who all these people are. So we got 66 names that we could identify, plus there's some torn paper, and there might have been as many as 75 if you kind of allow for it. And he has already identified at least a quarter of them served at Bunker Hill or during the siege of Boston. Some may have died, but his research is incomplete at this point, and that is a very fascinating question that we don't have an answer to. It may be, and I think we're left guessing at the circumstances of signing, but signing may not have been a public thing, or not a private thing, you know, where it's posted somewhere and you go up there and just sign it, you know, whenever. It may have been in a church with your neighbors watching, and you're swearing. And we don't know for a fact, but that may be the case. But if that is the case, one would surmise that Tory-leaning people, or people who are okay with the British imperial policies, would sort of make themselves scarce. As a matter of fact, they might go to Freetown and sign up with the British 10th Regiment, which Mr. Daggett actually broke up a couple of months later. You know, it was a time of choosing sides and active resistance. So I'm thinking that if you were a loyalist, especially an outspoken one, you'd make yourself scarce and not show up to sign a document like that. Do I know that for a fact? I do not. And I suspect some of this research may reveal or deny that kind of insight. I did mention before there were no women, and at least by the names, there seems to be no people of color, unlike some of the other towns who do have signers like that. Sir?
I'm curious about the economic situation of the time when the covenant was executed. By boycotting British goods, were these people depriving themselves of things they couldn't otherwise get in the colony? So if you were a farmer and you need farm equipment, was it otherwise available or had to be imported? I'm trying to get a sense of how much of a commitment they represent.
Yes, depending on your livelihood, it could vary from an inconvenience to draconian. I'll give you for example of that. An earlier boycott that didn't have so much teeth was, and surviving documents from 1767, had to do with resistance to the Townshend duties. So I was involved with some colleagues at Harvard in verifying 660 signatures on that one, including some people who went on to be Tories, actually, at that date. I guess things weren't so differentiated. But when we put that paper to the light box, its watermark was of the finest paper from London. In 1767, apparently, the kind of paper that the Boston Sons of Liberty wanted this kind of Solemn League predecessor to be printed on was not available as a domestic manufacturer. So there was a lot of effort to build up industries that the Americans depended on, varying success with that. Very early in the Revolutionary War, for instance, Paul Revere was involved in creating a powder factory, as in gunpowder, but it was not effective in the amounts needed, so that the Continental Army, you're talking about 1, 2, 3 years later, ended up depending on the international alliances with France, suppliers of Dutch, and things like that, basically to supply military supplies, because the American domestic manufacturers weren't even close to it.
I'm wondering if the impracticality of the covenant may be part of the reason why it was supplanted, in that a boycott wasn't going to do it, and they had to resort to armed conflict.
That is definitely worth thinking about. And in general, there are people even now who strategize boycotts. Like if you call a boycott and there's no alternative source for the material that you're boycotting, it's just not going to be effective. You're shooting yourself in the foot. So point well taken on that one. But I would say for the Solemn League, I think the balance is that it was overtaken events. It focuses in on the Boston Port Bill, because by the time it printed and got before town meeting, so it was printed in the first week of June and distributed 1774. The date on your document, I think, is June 15th or 6th, no, July. So by the time it got in front of town meeting was weeks later. And these other intolerable acts, it seemed like every other ship coming from London had news of another one, even more outrageous than the Port Bill. So I think in that sense it was overtaken by events. Also, I think there was a recognition and the agitation that culminated in the First Continental Congress, which occurred during the summer of 1774, recognized that Massachusetts and the towns couldn't go it alone. In other words, if Attleborough had this really strict boycott and the folks down the road in Newport didn't, what kind of boycott is that? And I think there was a recognition of that sort of thing. Great question. Okay, we are so over time. Let's reconvene in the social room. And like I say, when you walk by, there's a desk there where you could participate in the raffle, get your own Solemn League document. Just promise me that you won't cut off the bottom and sell it on eBay. Somebody as foolish as I. Thank you very much.